welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's Tools and Technology Seminar Series. I also apologize for any inconvenience that anyone may have experienced by the fact that we sort of last minute had to pivot to remote only with no in-person viewing option. Hopefully that didn't cause too much inconvenience for anybody. So we have a couple more weeks. We're not meeting next week, of course, because of the Thanksgiving holiday, and then we'll have 2 more weeks, I think, once we return. I think that's the only announcement I have. So with that, I'll just introduce our speaker. Today we have Jonathan Gryak, who is a research assistant scientist in DCMB and MIDAS. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Marcy. Thank you for the invitation. I'm excited to.
Jonathan?
Yes.
Can
Hey,
I
Brian.
do something real quick? And I hate to
Yes,
be
of course.
a nuisance. I just wanted to log in here right at the beginning, and I logged out of the executive committee. Otherwise, I would be here. But I asked for permission to log in so I could announce to everybody that Marcy won a big award yesterday from the Endowment for the Basic Sciences as our research staff member of the year, which has a cash award, a lump sum payment, and a nice commemorative plaque. And you know, Aaron, I think, was going to come and give it to her, but I think everybody's like in Zoomville, and one of my memos earlier in the day fixed that one. So we're safe and sound, most of us at home. But I just wanted everybody to know that we're very, very proud of Marcy's contributions to the department and to the Taubman Health Sciences Library. And for many, many reasons that go way back, she's like our first bioinformationist. And we're really proud to be working with Marcy, and we're very grateful for everything that she does. So I just wanted everybody to hear that, because we mean it. And Marcy, this is really special, and forgive us for not having you be present at the thing, but that's another story that I won't get into. But nevertheless, know that you're valued by all of us.
Thank you, Brian. It means a lot, so I really appreciate it.
Right. So you know, I really I'm looking at this talk, and I'm upset, of course, because I'd much rather be learning about this than going and reviewing promotion packages. But yeah, they were nice enough to let me go, so I'm going to go back to that now. But and hey, Ray, good to see you. You know, I'm going to turn it over to you, Jonathan, and I just think this is it's wonderful to see you, Ray. It's just, I'm sure it's going to be interesting. Maybe, Jonathan, if you'd be willing to send me your PowerPoints, I'd love to take a look at it.
Of course.
About it.
Sure. Well, thank you, Brian.
Thanks so much, guys, and congratulations. And let's give Marcy a hand, okay? Because, you know, thank her for everything she's doing. She makes all this stuff go well. Thank you, Marcy.
Thank you.
Okay. I'll see you later.
Congratulations, Marcy. Thank you. Well, hopefully, you know, there'll be even more exciting things than that. It'll be hard to top it, though. So, so today I'll be talking about tensor-based methods for biomedical informatics. You know, Marcy has agreed to graciously monitor the chat. So as I go along, if there's any questions that you have, please ask them via the chat, and she can interrupt me anytime. Okay. Let's see. Here we go. So to start off, I just want to give an overview of the talk. We'll start with what are tensors. And, you know, I think many people have heard about them, or at least they're used a lot, or the name of them is used a lot. And of course, in TensorFlow and many other things, but we'll talk a little bit about mathematically what they are. You know, again, tensors are in some sense a generalization of matrices, though in other ways they're not. And so I want to talk about the differences between tensors and matrices, and hopefully use any knowledge you have from matrices and from linear algebra to sort of help you understand, you know, how tensors are and are not like matrices. There's a few different types of models that are used for tensors. Again, just like with matrices, what we want to do is we have some kind of data that gets put into a matrix or tensor form, and then we want to sort of break that data down and help use that structure to help understand, relationships in the data. So we'll go over a couple different models for tensors for doing that. I'm going to go over some applications for biomedical informatics, just like the talk says. I'll focus on one, which is work that I've done in using tensor analysis as a precursor for machine learning, but I'll mention a few others. And I'll end with a few different references and software packages that you can use to further your education and to get started with using tensors in your own research. So what are tensors? So there's a number of mathematical objects that are all referred to as tensors. In some sense, that makes it a bit challenging if you're just searching for yourself and trying to understand which tensors we're speaking about. But for this talk, and for most of you in terms of your use of tensors for data analysis, we're mostly looking at some sort of tensor which has an order D, and this is some object would exist in this space, and you can think of it as a D-dimensional array. As we'll talk about shortly, it's not really such an array but for the purpose of this talk, we can just think about it as sort of a higher dimensional matrix or a hypermatrix. Okay, and you've already seen some kinds of tensors, right? You know them by other names. So in this definition, a zero order tensor is just a scalar, right? Just a number in a field. We have a one order tensor, which is a vector. And then we have, second order tensors, which are matrices. Okay, so these are, lower order tensors. But when we talk about a tensor, we really mean the higher level ones, meaning that, D is 3 or higher, right? So what are they good for? Why should we bother looking at tensors? So one of the main uses of them, and this is what's useful for our purposes as informaticians, is to look at multi-factor relationships. So, many of you who work in genomics or bioinformatics, you're used to looking at correlation matrices, other kinds of pairwise distances, and in your analyses. So those are matrices. But when we have more than 2 factors, 3 or more, we can utilize tensors to capture potentially those interactions between those factors. Something that's different about tensors, at least in some circumstances, is that unlike in the matrix case, where if I take a matrix and I break it apart, there's essentially an infinite number of matrices that could potentially represent that same matrix that I broke apart. But for tensors, for some of the decompositions are actually unique, and that's something that makes it potentially more useful if we're trying to understand, which factors lead to, say, the result of a machine learning model, or which factors contribute, to some kind of analysis that we're doing. The fact that these can be potentially unique gives them some more meaning maybe than the matrix case. And lastly, another piece that's also important about tensors is that if the tensors have additional structure beyond the matrix, and so with that, and some of those structures enable you to have certain kinds of properties of the tensor and subsequently data that's contained in it remain sort of the same under certain kinds of transformations, right? So certain kinds of things in matrices that remain invariant or equivariant, for instance, like the determinant of a matrix, if you manipulate it, with some kind of orthogonal transformation, then the determinant stays the same. So tensors have this property, and this is in fact the first use of tensors, right? So tensors, if you think of tensors as in tensor calculus and tensors that are used in sort of general relativity or physics, the whole point of a tensor in that case was to have a set of properties that were coordinate free and that didn't depend on any particular basis. And so this is where they were initially used, but again, that's a different kind of tensor than the kind of data tensors that we're talking about today. So just to emphasize again this point, which is that while we will use a hypermatrix, this higher order array to represent a tensor, these are just representations. So if we manipulate these hypermatrices in any which way, we may destroy some of the structures that there. Or if we take the hypermatrix and break it apart, we're not guaranteed that what we do with it when we do that decomposition will preserve some of the properties of the tensor. So that's just something to keep in mind. But again, we'll talk about some of the ways in which people have tried to still carefully, process the tensor so that you retain some of these properties. Okay, so I'm talking abstractly, and so I want to, give you some examples of different types of tensors and what type of data potentially will comes in that format. So there are, types of data which naturally give rise to tensors. All right, so we can think about any kind of color image. So a red, green, blue color image using that color space. It's a three-dimensional tensor. As are hyperspectral images which are taken with different wavelengths of light. We have in the medical space, we have CT and MRI volumes. So we're taking slices of, and visualizing a patient's internal anatomy. And through that, we're getting a volume which can represent, the abdominal pelvic region or someone's head. And so those are naturally third order tensors as well. And video is, color video, which now we have 3 frames, red, green, and blue. That's third order tensor, and it's over time. We have a 4th dimension. So these are 4D tensors, okay? Another thing which naturally arises, any kind of joint probability distribution for random variables, more than 2, can also be represented as a tensor. So but the piece that makes these interesting for us for the purposes of analysis is that we can arrange data in the form of a tensor, then hopefully use that for analysis, right? So what can that be? So as I mentioned, the use of tensors is hopefully, one of their main uses is multi-factor analysis. So if we have, say, 5 variables, and they're all interacting with each other, we can potentially construct a 5th order tensor that somehow represents all of the interactions between these 5 variables. Another thing which is useful, especially for people who do sort of systems, you work with systems, differential equations, things like that, is that if we want to take a function and discretize it, right, because usually we have to solve such systems numerically, we can take a function, say it's a third order, a function of 3 variables, and evaluate it at points, say, on a grid. And then that tensor that we get out of that will be a discretized version of that function. So these are 2 ways in which data tensors can come about. But I'll give you some concrete examples now. So here's an image of the outside of Palmer Commons. And so this is a third order tensor. You can see that I've broken it up into 3 channels, right? So we have these first 2, which these colons here represent these first 2 indices. So it's the width and height of the picture, and then the last one is the third dimension of the tensor, and that corresponds to the color channel. So we see this is the color one on top is broken up into the 3 channels, red, green, and blue, that we see here. So this is a natural tensor that occurs. We have another example here. This is a hyperspectral image. So as you'll see in this animation, this is a satellite taking an image of the Kennedy Space Center in Florida at different wavelengths of light, both infrared and visible light. And so you get different images with each frequency, and consequently you get a third order tensor out of this. As I mentioned, we have CT or MRI volumes. In this case, we see here this is from a CT volume of an abdominal pelvic region. And we see that we've segmented the bones that are visualized in here, including the ribs and the pelvis. And then this is a 3D reconstruction of that segmentation. So this is, again, a tensor, just a third order one. So here's an example of a data tensor. This is something that's known as Eigenfaces, which is a way of doing facial recognition using linear or multilinear algebra. And in this case, this is a sort of visualization of a 5th order tensor where we have different people's faces. So it's a 2-dimensional grayscale picture of a face, but then looking at the face from different angles, looking at it from different illuminations, and then looking at different people. So what we see here, again, once you move above 3 dimensions, it's hard for us to visualize, of course, but at least in this case, we're sort of seeing what you could potentially do by taking your data and putting it into a tensor and capturing relationships at higher dimensions with it. And then another example of this is which is a recent example and related to bioinformatics, which is at this paper from Siegel in 2019. They were looking at phosphophorylation responses for certain molecules of breast cancer cell lines. And they created this tensor here, which again, this is a 5th order tensor, where they're looking at different cell lines, which have different genomic or different diversities. They have different ligands, they have different doses of growth factors. And then within these 3 factors, they have time points for 2 different proteins there. So this winds up being a 5th order tensor. And again, this is, we're trying the best to visualize it here. But again, what we can see here is that I have a way of using a tensor to capture these multi-factor relationships and then potentially use, techniques, then analyze it. Okay, so we have natural tensors. We have tensors we can take our data and put them into. So again, you may have, most of us have had experience with using matrices and looking at relationships and analyzing matrices in all different ways. So even though a matrix is a 2nd order tensor, tensors are 3rd order or higher, they tend to exhibit greater complexity. And this winds up showing itself in various kinds of things we try to do in analysis. So the types of operations that we do, how much computational power is required to perform these analyses. And then also we have challenges related to how to determine the ranks of the tensor, as well as how to approximate them. And we'll touch on that a little bit later as well. So in terms of operations, so now that we have more than rows and columns, we now have other dimensions that we can potentially look at this tensor at. All the other kind of common operations that we do with matrices now become more complicated, in part because we have more sort of flexibility there, right? So in a matrix, what are the different parts we can have? We can have rows, the columns. We can take a matrix and have a submatrix out of it, right? We can segment it. So in a tensor, we can think about, there are many more different kinds of substructures that are there. Fibers might be a single column, but again, those columns, can be in any dimension of the tensor. We have slices, which will be 2-dimensional pieces. And then we have subtensors, which can be all different kinds of sizes. So if you have a 5th order tensor, you could have a subtensor of any dimension less than that, 4, 3, 2, 1. When we have a transpose of a matrix, there's only one transpose, and we take the transpose of itself and then we get the matrix back. But with a tensor, there's actually a exponential number of transposes that is contingent upon the dimension of the tensor. So like in a 3rd order tensor, that means we would have 6 possible transposes, 6 ways of moving the tensor around and changing which entries are in which dimension. For a matrix, we have we want to multiply 2 matrices. We have a standard matrix multiplication. When we want to multiply a tensor in a matrix, we actually have many different ways of doing that. And the sort of generalization for that is something that's known as contractions. And you can think of it as taking some part of the tensor and another part of another tensor, and somehow multiplying some entries together, summing them together to get some other tensor. They can be bigger or smaller than the original tensors. Again, these are much more complicated than in the matrix case. And there are other kind of products which exist for tensors that don't exist for matrices. So I mentioned for the contraction, which is actually a tensor-tensor product, but you can do tensor matrix products as well. And that's what this N-mode product is. So many more options when you're looking at a tensor versus a matrix. So in terms of complexity, we could think about what are the things that we do for a matrix to figure out, a structure or understanding. So we can look at eigenvalues and symmetric matrices or singular values for, rectangular matrices. We can look at the spectral norm, which is the measure of the largest singular value, the neutrino norm, which is the sum of the, singular values in the matrix. We could look at the rank, right? How many columns of a matrix do we need to represent it? Or we can look at some kind of, rank 1 approximation. So again, in the case of a matrix, if I take just, 2 vectors, one from each vector space, and I multiply them together, I can get a rank 1 approximation of the matrix. However, for all of these questions in a tensor, they're all NP hard, right? So they are as hard as any other problem in the NP that's NP complete. So what does that mean? Doesn't mean that we can't. It just means that we wind up having to use approximation for all these types of things. Okay, so this is something to keep in mind, that both in terms of, you know, the algorithms themselves are challenging, and also the tensors can get very, very large. And this can start getting, you know, just in terms of raw processing power, you may have, you know, even a third order or fourth order tensor can have, you know, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of entries. And so we start running into memory and other kinds of computational, you know, issues when we work with them. So we've looked at how matrices and tensors differ, and, you know, different types of tensors. So I wanted to talk about, you know, some of the ways in which we can analyze them. Unfortunately, just like as you can imagine with all the different operations with tensors, we start getting, you know, the indexing them, telling, you know, knowing which, you know, which part of the tensor we're referring to starts getting complex. And so there'll be some notation here that we'll have to use. And there's no good way of doing this in a way that doesn't complicate it. So I apologize for that. But if you have any questions, please, or don't understand some notation I'm using, and please let me know. So I will try to make it a little easier by using sort of scripts to denote tensors, bold to be matrices, and then vectors as just lowercase letters. And so when I describe some of the ways in which we analyze a tensor, there's a few kinds of products that we'll need to use. And so those would be the outer product, which I'm sure you've seen before, a Cauchy-Rao product, which you may not be used to. And of course, this end-mode product, which I mentioned, which is a way of multiplying a tensor by a matrix. There are other ones as well. There's a Kronecker product and Hadamard product that are sometimes used. The Hadamard product, if you're used to doing things with neural networks, that's just an element-wise multiplication. And so that's often used, but we're going to skip those two for now and just focus on these other three, as we'll need them to describe some of the analytical methods we use. So one thing that we often want to do in getting at a piece of the tensor is to sort of unfold it in one kind of dimension. The idea is to take this tensor and sort of turn it into a matrix, and do so in a consistent way and with respect to one of its modes, one of the dimensions of the tensors, right? So here's an example of this. So I have a tensor here that this is a 2 by 3 by 2 tensor. It's an order 3 tensor. And I'm looking at these sort of slices of the tensor. So this, you can think of this A1 and A2, whereas the A1 sort of being, if I stack them on top of each other, sort of into the screen, that this one would be the first one in front and this one would be the one behind. So if I wanted to take this, you know, this little, you know, rectangular solid of a tensor and turn it into a matrix, I could do so in the first mode. And what happens here is that I just wind up getting, since the first mode has a dimension 2, and then the other modes I'm multiplying together, it's 6. I get a 2 by 6 matrix. And you can see what this winds up being here is that it's just really a concatenation of these two matrices, right? A11 is here and A2 is here. And so this is the flattening of it. Again, you can flatten this in either respect to mode 2 or mode 3. But this is one of the ways in which you can represent the tensor as just back to a matrix. Now, again, if you make manipulations on the tensor in this unfolding, you need to be careful because you may wind up, you know, changing the structure of the tensor. So you have to be careful again about how you use this unfolding. Now, there's a few products that I mentioned. So there's the outer product, and you may be used to this just from, you know, you can do this with vectors. And the idea with the outer product is that you take, you know, two vectors or matrices or tensors, and you wind up multiplying every element of one of these objects by every other one, right? So the indices looks complicated, but that's really all you're doing. You're multiplying every possible combination of entry in the A by every one in B. So here's a, you know, concrete example. If I have two vectors, right? So just 1, 2, and 3, 5, I can take their outer product and I get a matrix. You notice that now, rather than like the inner product where I get a single number, I'm getting a larger, you know, tensor, in this case, a matrix, out of this outer product. And so this, you can use this for vectors or matrices or tensors to form larger and higher order tensors. So that's the outer product. this Cauchy-Rao product is sort of kind of like taking a column of a matrix B and multiplying the column by every entry in the matrix A. So we have an example here. So if I take a matrix A and a matrix B, right, and I get this is the Cauchy-Rao product of it, you see that I have now a dimension, these are both 2 by 2, right, and I get a 4 by 2 matrix. And what's in the first column here is simply the column B, but multiplied first by 3 and then multiplied by 6. That's what I have here. And then this right-hand column is the second column B, but first one is scaled by 5 and the next one is scaled by 10. So this is another product that is used in matrices, and we'll see how it's used shortly. So please bear with me. And then the last one I wanted to mention that we'll need is the end-mill product. And again, the idea here is that I want to find a way of multiplying a matrix by a tensor, but now a tensor has, all these potential sort of slices, 2-dimensional slices of it. So what does it mean to multiply it by a matrix? Well, I can take a matrix as long as it has the right, dimensions. I could take this matrix and multiply it in any of the modes. And then here's an example from the tensor I had a few slides ago, where if I took that tensor, which is this tensor here, you recall, and I have this flattening, I can multiply it by this matrix here, B, and I wind up getting this. So this is the mode 1 product. So I have a flattening of the matrix, of the tensor, and I'm multiplying by this matrix in that with respect to that flattening. And that's how this mode end product shakes out. So we have some products here, and now we can talk about the ways in which we want to sort of break down the tensor and begin to analyze it, okay? So as I mentioned, just like in the matrix case, we want to find a way of taking this large objects, breaking it into sub-objects, and somehow that tells us something about the data that's there, right? So there are multiple types of decomposition, just like there are in matrix decomposition. We have non-negative factorization, we have QR decompositions, and LU and so forth. The two that are most common and are amongst the oldest ones for tensors are I'm going to refer to them as the canonical polyadic, or CP, and then the Tucker decomposition. Although they go by many names, they were rediscovered multiple times, and as often happens, things were developed, and over time people realized that these are actually different facets of the same type of object. So those are the two that I want to talk about today, although I'll mention 3 other ones which are useful for other applications, and they may be useful for you, and you can look these up if you're interested. So there is the orthogonal decomposition model, sometimes known as ODECO. And this is mostly useful in higher order statistics. If you have some kind of cumulant or other kind of tensor representing a joint distribution or some other statistical object, then orthogonal decompositions have a lot of use there because there's certain kind of properties about that come from statistics that enable this decomposition to be useful there, whereas those assumptions aren't true necessarily in general data. You may see things that are known as tensor trains, which also go by the name matrix product states. So these are used in quantum information theory, but they are also being used, tensor trains are also being used in certain types of neural networks and other kinds of decompositions. Again, it's just another way of breaking down the tensor into parts, and sometimes has more, makes it more computationally feasible than others. Another one which I think is more recent, but also has some promise, which is a quiver representation. And the use for this in terms of analyzing data is that, if I'm thinking of a tensor and I have, think of it as, the interactions of all these variables. I'm looking at, as I mentioned, for cell lines, ligands, and whatever else I was measuring. I have 3 things here, but what if I don't have all that information for each of those modes? Or what if, I can't quite align them. They don't have the same dimensions, they don't line up. So quiver representations can be used to sort of still match these things together in a way using tensors where the different kinds of data modalities you have may not have the same dimensions. And so this is something as well that is relatively recent in its application to data analysis or tensor analysis. And this is something else that you can also look into further. So I'm going to focus on CP and Tucker. So what is a CP decomposition? So we take a dth order tensor and we break it up into a sum of rank 1 components. Okay, so this is just the outer product here. And so what does this look like? This is a depiction of a third order tensor. And that means I can break it up into vectors. Each vector corresponds to one of the vector spaces or the modes of the tensor. And I can form the outer product of them. When I form the outer product of this, I take two of them, I get a matrix. I take the third one, I get a tensor. So these wind up being, essentially another third order tensors, but I'm summing them together. And I'm going to use this as an approximation of my larger tensor. In some sense, if you look at the singular value decomposition in a matrix, this is essentially the same kind of thing. You can formulate a singular value decomposition as, a outer product of the left singular vector and right singular vector, along with the scaling by the singular values, and that can give you a approximation to your matrix. And this is in some sense the tensor form of that. By the way, I'm leaving out certain kinds of scalar factors and stuff just to make it simpler. One of the things that we can do in analysis, and we'll use this as we see our case study a little later, is that I can take these individual vectors here and sort of put them as columns into matrices that I'll call factor matrices. And what that enables me to do is essentially calculate the tensor in each mode and its flattening as a product of these factor matrices, as well as its other flattening. So this enables me to represent the tensor using these factor matrices and looking at it at any which mode that I want. And sometimes you can just summarize this as here, where I'm just putting the factor matrices in this little double brackets. So the CP decomposition is where we get one of the notions of the rank of a tensor, right? So the minimum number of factors, the minimum number of these tensor summands that we have is the CP rank, or rank of the tensor. This is kind of like SVD, where we're looking at the number of linearly independent columns in that are giving me the rank of the matrix. So what's different, though, as I mentioned, is that what's nice about the CP decomposition is that if I do this decomposition, it is unique up to a permutation of the factors. So I can take this, I can take this one here and I can move it over here, just a sum, doesn't matter. Or I can permute the dimensions of it. I can move C to B, B to A, and so forth, or rotate it. That's not going to change things. And I can scale it. I can multiply all these by scaling factors, and it's not going to change the decomposition. So again, because of that uniqueness, which is different from a matrix case, this makes this suitable for doing either factor analysis, understanding which of these factors are relevant to my problem. And also it's useful, as we'll see a little later, for feature extraction, where I have data in a tensor form, and I want to extract features from it so that I can potentially use them in, say, in a machine learning pipeline, something like that. All right. And the algorithm which is most widely used for this is known as CP alternating least squares, or CP-ALS. This algorithm has challenges with it, but overall, in terms of its numerical stability and other challenges, but overall, this is still widely used as a method for performing CP decompositions. All right. The other main decomposition that people use is known as the Tucker decomposition. And so in this decomposition, what we do is we take the tensor and we break it up into some kind of smaller core tensor. And then we have other matrices, one per mode, which are used as M mode products. So we try to reconstruct the tensor by making a smaller core tensor along with matrices that are in each mode. Right. So you can think of this as a higher order principal component analysis. It's essentially the same thing, and that's how it was originally created. But unlike the CP decomposition, it's not unique, right? I can get I can find matrices that I can multiply the core tensor by, as well as multiply the factor matrices by, and I'll get the same approximation out. So it's not necessarily good for factor analysis, but what that does enable you to do is it allows you to sort of be selective about which tensor you want, or which core tensor you want. For instance, you may want a sparse tensor, one that has a lot of zeros in it. And so what that enables you to do is hopefully get an approximation into your tensor, which is much smaller. And so that makes this kind of decomposition suitable for compression, also for denoising a tensor as well. And there are multiple algorithms that you can use for a Tucker decomposition. 3 common ones are something called HOSVD. So it's like a higher order analog of signal value decomposition. There's higher order orthogonal iteration, or HOI, which is a great name. And there's also a Tucker version of ALS that rather than producing a CP decomposition, it will produce a Tucker decomposition. So those are the 2 main decompositions that you'll see lots and lots of literature on. Again, they're used extensively in various kinds of data applications. So now that I think you've seen some of the decompositions, I'm hoping that we can do a sort of case study in how these could potentially be used as part of a broader machine learning pipeline. So this is a work that myself and my colleagues in the Najarian lab have done. And this was looking at trying to make predictions about hemodynamic deterioration, which is are potentially life-threatening events that happen following cardiac surgery. And so what we proposed in this work is to take a multimodal approach, meaning that we have all the data that's available of different types, including electronic health record data and physiological signals like electrocardiogram, PPG, arterial blood pressure, and use all this information to make predictions about who is going to, over a long period, potentially, hours in advance, predict who might have an adverse event, particularly something that leads to hemodynamic decompensation or deterioration, which is life-threatening. So the challenge, though, is that we want to look at potentially, since we're trying to make predictions, we want to look at trends in the data, particularly the waveforms that maybe are not just the immediate trends, like looking at just a heart rate at a given time or irregularity, but potentially longer-term trends in the waveform. And so the challenge is, how do we capture the waveforms at different scales and then get features out of that, but then still find a way of reducing the total number of features relative to the data set samples that we have, so that we can make a high-performing model. And so unsurprisingly, the answer in this case was utilizing tensor decomposition. So here's a sort of overall pipeline of how this works, and I'll go over these steps in a minute. But essentially, we have different kinds of waveform data. So as I mentioned, ECG, blood pressure, and a PPG, which is measuring peripheral oxygen saturation. And we have a way of capturing the sort of trends in the signal at different scales. And we extract some features from that. And then we turn them into tensors, and then we perform some kind of dimensionality reduction. Okay, and so ultimately, this whole process uses tensor formation and decomposition to create features that then go into machine learning models. On the EHR data side, we did something, it's a little less complicated in that we've take the EHR feature data, we did feature selection, and then use PCA to sort of reduce those again down. But we have 2 sort of arms of this pipeline. One again is starting to use tensors to analyze the signals. The other one is analyzing the EHR, but both go into the machine learning model to make the prediction. Okay, so the way that we can capture, one way at least of capturing trends at multiple scales, is the use of a taut string. And so this is a method for sort of making a piecewise linear approximation of a function. And we can control how good of or how tight that approximation is by this parameter epsilon. So here's 2 beats of a ECG. And from the left to the right, we have different values of epsilon. And we see that it's maybe a little hard to see in the left and right, but we have some smoothing that occurs, but on the right-hand side, we see that what we get is just almost pretty much the QRS complex. On the right, we get very, we're really just getting the core pieces of this, or the main features of the signal. So again, you can modify the epsilon to get different scales of the signal. So this is how we can extract, looking at the waveform at different scales. So how do we form tensors from that? So here's a sample of ECG. In addition to looking at the waveform at different scales, I want to look at the waveform at different parts of the waveform. So I'm breaking it up into different windows of signal, and that's what these dashed lines here represent. So now I have different epsilons, different scales, I have different windows, and then I can take from those each window and each scale, I can extract certain features. In this case, there's 6 features we're extracting from this, which relate to things like changes in curvature and other kinds of morphological features of the signal. And so from this, I get a 5 by 6 by 5 tensor, a third order tensor. Okay, so theoretically, I could just take this tensor and, flatten it and get a, 150 features. But instead, what I want to do is I want to try to utilize a tensor structure to find something which is a bit more, meaningful than that. So what we wind up doing is to take the tensors from, again, this is a machine learning problem. So we have patients that are in a training set and patients in a test set. I can take the tensors from each of the patients in my training set, and I can wind up stacking them together. And so now I have a 4th order tensor. If I have M patients, I have a 5 by 6 by 5 by M 4th order tensor. I can perform CPALS to get out certain factor matrices, so A, B, C, and D. And so A might correspond to the windows, and B corresponds to the actual features themselves. C will be the epsilon values, and D are the patients. That's the sort of patient mode. Right? So what I want to do is ultimately, I want to find a way of taking or extracting the features, which is this B factor, from other patients when I'm going to apply this on a test set. So in the training part, I take all of my patient tensors, stack them, and get these factor matrices out. So what do I do in the test case? So if I have a patient who's in the test set, now what I want to do is somehow use the information from the training, this sort of trying to capture the overall trends that exist of these patients in these tensors, and somehow use that information to create features for testing. So what I can do is recall that I can take a tensor, this is a 3rd order tensor, and I have this relationship between its factor matrices, if I have a CP decomposition, and its flattening. This is the flattening in mode 2. So what I can do is I can take these matrices A and C from the training step, right, and these correspond to the T1 and T3 matrices. And what I need to do is find out what this T2 is. And this T2 corresponds to the features that I'm interested in. And so what I can do is simply compute the pseudo inverse of the 2 factor matrices, and that will allow me to solve this problem. Essentially, it's just a least squares problem, and it solves for this T2, which winds up being the features from this tensor for this patient. So that's what's done. And then to test this, we had over almost 1,000 cases of people recovering from cardiac surgery, and about 10% of them, or sorry, 8% of them had events. And we trained and validated this on 75% of the data, 25% for testing. There was a patient-wise split, so no patients occur in any fold, only individual folds. And we did shuffling of the data to sort of get an estimation of how this looks like over different patients, different groups of patients. So one of the things that came out of this is that the use of our multimodal approach produced the best results. So if we just use EHR data, we had lower results. If we use waveform, it was slightly more informative. Using, again, this waveform data here is the features extracted from tensor decomposition. But of course, when we combine them together, we wind up getting better results. So this helps show this, validate this part of our hypothesis. And then we can see from this graph, this is looking at sort of the mean AUC performance of a random forest model as well. And the shaded area here is sort of showing this, standard confidence interval over all those shuffles of the data. And we see that even predicting up to 12 hours in advance, we have relatively consistent performance in using this method. So this is one example of taking tensor decomposition and putting it into a machine learning pipeline for other analysis. So just to talk about a few other applications that may be of interest. So we have a former postdoc in our lab and now postdoc in Dr. Welch's lab, Maren Bagarian. She worked on utilizing a coupled matrix tensor completion from predicting drug target interactions. So in this case, this is kind of like we have a matrix, let's say drug target interactions with unknown values in it. We want to complete that using some side information, which are in tensors. We have a postdoc in mine in Kevon's lab, Christian, who has applied this to doing classification. So looking at, rather than taking a tensor and breaking it down into components, we want to just keep things as tensors and try to find a way of determining if there's a similarity between them and using that directly for classification. So you can do this in the standard matrix case using linear discriminant analysis, but when you move to the tensor form, it's called multilinear discriminant analysis. And he and our collaborators came up with a way of doing this, a better way than some of the other methods for doing this classification. And another one that might be of interest to people who are working more in the genomic side is that there's a paper from Belaeva in 2021, which is looking at the 3D organization of the genome in diploid organisms, and essentially looking at, rather than pairwise distances between loci on chromosomes, looking at these third order, 3 different distances, and then using that information and putting it in a tensor and then using that information to get better predictions on the structural or sort of spatial relationships of these tensors in these cells. So if you are working on that side of of the department, you want to check this paper out. So in summary, there's again a whole bunch of techniques that I've just briefly talked about. So for CP decompositions, those can be useful for feature extraction and factor analysis. Tucker decompositions, again, some of the algorithms for that are HUSVD or HUI, and those can be useful for compression or for denoising. That's often, for instance, used in denoising of images. Multilinear discriminant analysis can be used for classification of tensors directly rather than breaking them apart and putting them into models. Completion can be used for modeling drug target interactions or any kind of pairwise interactions, and also other kinds of recommender systems, any other kind, things like are done on Netflix, or when you look at, you're shopping on Amazon, you say, you bought this product, you may like this. These are recommender systems. So tensor completion can be used to solve those kinds of problems, but in the higher order format. Okay, there's a few different packages that have a lot of these algorithms and methods for manipulating tensors built in. So in Python, there's a package called Tensorly, and so you can use that to manipulate this in Python, as well as it has some plugins for some of for TensorFlow and also MXNet, other kinds of machine learning packages. And then there's 2 other ones. The MATLAB may not be the most popular choice, but although again in our lab we tend to use MATLAB, for many of our things. But Tensor Toolbox, which is from Sandia National Labs, and that's something we tend to use. And there's another package from some other prominent tensor mathematicians, Tensor Lab. So those 2 are available. Just wanted to draw your attention to maybe a few other references if you're interested in learning more. So there's a seminal paper by Kola and Bader, again from Sandia National Labs, which talks about tensor decompositions, including CP as well as Tucker, and many, many other types that people have developed over the years. So you can take a look at that. This 2015 paper from Chikaki talks about tensor decompositions for signal processing, but also for use in machine learning. And again, he uses a Tucker model, which again, I don't think is the best approach. I think a CP works better, but there's still a lot of good information in that paper. And there's another more recent paper specifically on tensor-based approaches for cardiac applications, this POTI paper. So with that, I'll end. If you have any questions, you're welcome to contact me. And if you have any now, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'll give you a round of applause.
Thank you.
If anyone has questions, you can either put them in the chat box or you can unmute yourself. Not seeing anything yet, but maybe we'll just give it a couple of minutes in case anyone's typing.
Sure.
Dana did write in, no question, but great talk, and just thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.